On a December morning in 1975, federal marshals walked into 926 East McLemore Avenue in Memphis, Tennessee. They told everyone inside they had 15 minutes to leave the building. 15 minutes. The building was seized. Al Bell, the man who had transformed Stax Records into the most commercially powerful black-owned music company in America, was escorted out at gunpoint. The label that had built Otis Redding, Isaac Hayes, Sam and Dave, and the Staple Singers was gone, and the debt that killed it was $1,900. Number 12. Carla Thomas. Gee whiz, look at his eyes. 1960. The story of Stax Records begins with a 17-year-old girl and a song she recorded in a converted movie theater that still had the popcorn machine in the lobby. Carla Thomas was the daughter of Rufus Thomas, the disc jockey at Woodia, the most influential black radio station in Memphis. The first radio station in America to have an all-black format. Rufus Thomas was one of the most important figures in Memphis music before Stax existed. He was the man who had made Memphis radio what it was, and his daughter at 17 walked into the converted Capitol Theater on McLemore Avenue where Jim Stewart had set up his recording operation and recorded Gee Whiz, Look at His Eyes. The song was produced in the most basic possible way. No elaborate studio arrangements, no professional production infrastructure. The room had the acoustics of a movie theater because it had what the recording had was Carla Thomas's voice, clear, sweet, emotionally direct, rooted in the gospel tradition in a way that suggested something genuinely felt rather than commercially calculated. Atlantic Records picked up Gee Whiz for national distribution after Jim Stewart's sister, Estelle Axton, pushed for it. The song hit number 10 on the Hot 100 and number 5 on the R&B chart in 1961. It was Stax's first nationally charting record. The converted movie theater with the popcorn machine in the lobby had produced something that could compete with anything recorded in a professional studio. Carla Thomas became known as the Queen of Memphis Soul. She was 17 years old when she started Stax's commercial history. The label she helped launch would go on to place 100 over the next 15 years. It began in a movie theater with a teenage girl's voice. Number 11. Rufus Thomas. Walkin' the Dog. 1963. Rufus Thomas was 50 years old when he recorded Walkin' the Dog. 50. While Motown was signing teenagers from the Brewster Douglas housing projects and building acts around the youth culture of early 1960s America, Stax was releasing records by a middle-aged disc jockey from Memphis who had been in the entertainment business since the 1930s and understood something about black American music that no amount of production sophistication could replicate. He understood how to make a room have fun. Thomas had been the first artist to bring Stax a genuine commercial hit. She broke a needle and she can't stop walking the dog. 'Cause I Love You, a duet with Carla that predated Gee Whiz and demonstrated that the label's stripped-down, organic approach to recording could produce something that Atlantic Records would distribute nationally. By 1963, Thomas was well into his Stax career when he walked into the studio and recorded Walkin' the Dog, a horn-driven novelty record built around the dance move of the same name that reached number 10 on the Hot 100. The Rolling Stones heard Walkin' the Dog and covered it for their debut album. The specific cultural transmission, a 50-year-old black Memphis DJ's dance record becoming part of the repertoire of the group that would soon make the British invasion, is one of the most precise illustrations of how Stax's music traveled across the cultural landscape of the 1960s in ways that no commercial calculation could have predicted. Thomas continued recording for Stax through the 1970s. Do the Funky Chicken, Do the Push and Pull, a series of dance records that kept him commercially relevant into his 60s. He was, by any measure, one of the most consistently productive and entertaining recording artists in Stax's history. A 50-year-old disc jockey who danced better than anyone in the room. Number 10. Booker T and the MGs, Green Onions, 1962. The Stax House Band was one of the most important musical facts of the 1960s, and one of the least discussed. Booker T, Jones on Hammond organ, Steve Cropper on guitar, Louis Steinberg on bass, Al Jackson Jr. on drums, and eventually Donald "Duck" Dunn replacing Steinberg. They were the musicians who played on virtually every Stax recording of the 1960s, the instrumental foundation on which Otis Redding and Sam and Dave and Wilson Pickett built their voices. What made the MGs historically significant beyond their musical contribution was their composition. This was 1962, Memphis, Tennessee. The civil rights movement was 3 years from its legislative peak, and the Stax House Band was integrated, 2 white musicians and 2 black musicians in a converted movie theater in Memphis, making music together with a naturalness and a mutual respect that the city and the culture surrounding them had not yet formally acknowledged as possible. Green Onions, recorded on a Sunday afternoon in 1962, when a session artist didn't show up and the band started jamming, became Stax's signature instrumental, a Hammond organ groove so distinctive that it has been used in films, television shows, and commercials for 6 decades without losing any of its original authority. The throwaway B-side that Booker T described recording because we couldn't have a one-sided record hit number 3 on the Hot 100. The Stax House Band was, in the specific socially conscious language of 1960s Memphis, a radical act. Playing music together across the color line, in a studio on McLemore Avenue, before the Civil Rights Act, before the formal legislative acknowledgement that what they were doing in that room was something American society was supposed to value. The music they made together made the argument more completely than any speech could have. If you're locked into this one, most people scrolling past these songs have no idea what it took to make them. We digs that history back up, one record at a time. The subscribe button costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one. Number 9, Otis Redding, Try a Little Tenderness, 1966.
Now I know she's waiting.
Otis Redding arrived at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival as the artist most of the audience had never seen perform live. He was known in the Black American music world, deeply, reverently known as the most compelling live soul performer of his generation. He was largely unknown to the white rock festival audience that had come to Monterey for Jefferson Airplane and The Who and Janis Joplin. He sang 6 songs. He closed with Try a Little Tenderness.
Try just a little bit of...
Originally a 1933 pop standard that Redding had transformed entirely, beginning as a gentle ballad and building to one of the most physically overwhelming performances of the 1960s.
But while she's there waiting,
the tempo accelerating, the arrangement exploding, Redding spending everything he had until the song was over. The crowd gave him a standing ovation that the film cameras captured as one of the most significant moments in the history of American popular music. That performance at Monterey Pop was in June 1967. Otis Redding had been the defining voice of the Stax sound. Raw, urgent, emotionally committed past the point where conventional performance stopped and something closer to testimony began. He was 26 years old. He was at the peak of his commercial and artistic powers. He had just crossed over from the Chitlin circuit to the rock festival world in the most complete possible way. On December 10, 1967, Otis Redding's plane crashed into Lake Monona near Madison, Wisconsin. He was 26 years old. 4 days earlier, he had recorded a song called "Sittin' on the Dock of the Bay," a departure from his earlier work, quieter, more reflective, the first song where he had whistled on a record because he couldn't think of the right lyric for the final section. He never heard it on the radio. He never knew it would be his biggest hit. Number 8, Wilson Pickett, "In the Midnight Hour," 1965. Wilson Pickett did not record "In the Midnight Hour" for Stax Records in the conventional sense of the label-artist relationship. He recorded it at Stax at the McLemore Avenue studio with the Stax house musicians. But he was an Atlantic Records artist sent to Memphis by producer Jerry Wexler, who understood that the specific combination of Pickett's raw, shouting vocal style and the Stax rhythm section would produce something neither could achieve independently.
Would you play it for me now, Redding?
What Wexler understood was the specific chemistry of the Stax sound, the looseness, the organic feel of musicians working together rather than following charts, the willingness to let a groove settle before developing it. He sent Pickett to Memphis because Memphis was where that chemistry existed.
In the midnight hour, yes I am, oh yes I am.
And on the night before the session, Pickett and Steve Cropper wrote "In the Midnight Hour" in a hotel room. At the session, Wexler physically demonstrated the rhythm he wanted, doing what he called the jerk, the dance move circulating through Black American popular culture, showing Al Jackson Jr. where the beat needed to land. Jackson watched him dance, locked it in, and the groove was established. The song hit number 1 on the R&B chart and number 21 on the pop chart. It became the definitive Wilson Pickett recording and one of the most recognized pieces of soul music in history. But here is the specific thing. Wilson Pickett recording at Stax was never credited to Stax. The records were released on Atlantic. The commercial benefit went to Atlantic. The Stax musicians, whose specific contribution made the recording what it was, received session fees and no royalties on Atlantic's releases. The relationship between Stax and Atlantic would eventually become the instrument of Stax's near destruction when Atlantic retained all pre-1968 masters after the distribution deal ended. Number 7, Sam and Dave, Soul Man, 1967. Sam Moore and Dave Prater were not a Stax discovery in the conventional sense. They had been performing together since 1961, working the Southern Soul circuit without achieving commercial breakthrough before Jerry Wexler of Atlantic Records signed them and sent them, like Wilson Pickett before them, to Memphis and to the specific chemistry of the Stax studio. At Stax, they were assigned to Isaac Hayes and David Porter, the in-house songwriting team whose collaboration would define the sound of late 1960s Stax soul. Hayes and Porter wrote their songs. The MGs played behind them. The horns from the Memphis Horns punctuated their call and response vocal exchanges. And the result was a run of recordings between 1966 and 1968. that represents one of the most concentrated stretches of commercial quality in the history of American soul music. Soul Man, released in 1967, hit number 2 on the Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart. It was produced by Hayes and Porter, built around a guitar riff that Steve Cropper had developed with a specific rhythmic insistence. The sound of pride, of defiance, of the specific quality of being a soul man rather than merely having soul. The song was recorded in the summer of 1967, the same summer that Detroit was burning. 13 years later, in 1980, John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd performed Soul Man as the Blues Brothers in their film of the same name. The scene, in full costume, with an enormous band, in front of an ecstatic audience, introduced the song to an entirely new generation. Sam Moore watched this happen from outside the commercial infrastructure that had generated it. The original duo had split years earlier, the partnership destroyed by personal conflict and the financial pressures of a career in soul music during an era when being a soul man didn't always pay what the music was worth. Number 6. Eddie Floyd, Knock on Wood, 1966. Eddie Floyd wrote Knock on Wood during a thunderstorm. This is documented. He was staying at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, the same motel where Martin Luther King Jr. would be assassinated 2 years later, and a thunderstorm had started. Floyd was superstitious, which is relevant.
You made me cry.
Knock on Wood is a song about superstition, about the specific human practice of touching wood to ward off bad luck, about the fear that happiness is too good to last and requires rituals of protection.
Oh, yeah.
He called Steve Cropper, who was in another room at the motel. Cropper came over. They wrote the song together, working through the night while the storm continued. They recorded it at Stax the following day. Knock on Wood reached number 28 on the pop chart and number 1 on the R&B chart. It became one of the most covered songs in the history of soul music, recorded by artists ranging from David Bowie to Ami Stewart, whose 1979 disco version hit number 1 in the United Kingdom. The Lorraine Motel, where Floyd wrote the song, is now the National Civil Rights Museum, a museum built around the site of King's assassination on April 4, 1968. The balcony from which King was shot is preserved exactly as it was. The building that housed Room 306, where Floyd had made his superstitious gestures against bad luck while a thunderstorm raged over Memphis, is now a monument to the specific intersection of American racial violence and American cultural achievement that Memphis in the 1960s represented more completely than perhaps any other place in the country. Number 5. Albert King, Born Under a Bad Sign, 1967. Albert King was 6 feet 4 inches tall and played his left-handed guitar upside down, a right-handed guitar with the strings in their original order, played by a left-handed man, producing a specific tension and release in his bending technique that no right-handed guitarist could exactly replicate. He was, in the specific technical sense that guitar players use when they are serious about what they are saying, one of the most distinctive and influential guitarists in the history of American music. He recorded Born Under a Bad Sign for Stax's Stax subsidiary in 1967, written by William Bell and Booker T. Jones. It became the title track of his landmark Stax album and one of the most widely covered blues recordings in history. Eric Clapton heard it and recorded it with Cream for their Wheels of Fire double album in 1968. Clapton's version, faithful to King's original but refracted through the British blues rock lens, introduced born under a bad sign to an enormous rock audience that had never heard of Albert King. The pattern of what happened next is now familiar. Cream's version generated enormous commercial income. The album went gold. The publishing royalties flowed to the songwriters. Albert King received what his Stax recording contract entitled him to, which was the standard Southern Soul contract arrangement of the era, structured for the label's benefit rather than the artist's. King continued touring until his death in 1992. He became, in his later years, the subject of a specific kind of artistic reverence that comes when the musicians who were most directly influenced by you have achieved the kind of mainstream recognition that allows them to name their sources publicly. Stevie Ray Vaughan cited Albert King as his primary influence. Vaughan played with King and recorded with him. The man who played his guitar upside down, in the wrong key, with the strings in reverse order, he had been right all along about everything. Number 4. Isaac Hayes, theme from Shaft, 1971. Isaac Hayes had been the invisible engine behind much of Stax's commercial peak, the songwriter and producer who had written Soul Man and Hold On I'm Comin' and dozens of other recordings for Sam and Dave and other Stax artists, while his own recording career was less prominently positioned. When Stax lost its Atlantic distribution deal in 1968 and its entire pre-1968 catalog with it, Hayes became the artist most responsible for establishing what the label's post-Atlantic era would sound like. Hot Buttered Soul, released in 1969, demonstrated what Hayes was capable of when given full creative freedom. Long-form orchestrated soul productions that operated at a formal scale that pop radio hadn't previously accommodated. The album sold 2 million copies. It gave Stax its commercial momentum back at the exact moment the label needed it most. Then came Shaft. The 1971 film directed by Gordon Parks needed a score. Hayes composed and performed it. The theme from Shaft, with its specific combination of wah-wah guitar, orchestral strings, and the opening percussion that announces itself as something genuinely new, hit number 1 on the Hot 100. And at the 1972 Academy Awards, Isaac Hayes won the Oscar for Best Original Song, becoming the first black artist to win an Academy Award in a non-acting category. He walked to the podium wearing a vest made of gold chains. He had written music that sounded like nothing that had come before it, and he had been acknowledged by the most prestigious commercial awards ceremony in the world for doing so. Stax was at its commercial peak. The collapse that was coming was not yet visible. The man in the gold chain vest was, in that specific moment, the most commercially successful artist in the history of a label that had competed with Motown for 15 years. Number 3. The Staple Singers, I'll Take You There, 1972. The Staple Singers came to Stax in 1968, after years at Epic Records, bringing with them the specific combination of gospel conviction and social engagement that had made them one of the most important vocal groups in the history of Black American music.
What you doing?
Mavis Staples' voice, impossibly deep, rooted in church and blues, and the specific experience of growing up black in the Mississippi Delta and then in Chicago, had been attracting attention since the 1950s.
Let me take you there.
I'll Take You There, recorded in 1972, became Stax's biggest-selling single. It hit number 1 on both the Hot 100 and the R&B chart, and sold over 3 million copies in the United States alone. Numbers that rivaled anything Motown had released. The recording was built on a reggae-influenced rhythm that Al Bell had borrowed from a Johnny Nash production and given to the group, and on a bass line descended from the Staples touring organist Al Duncan's understanding of what the rhythm needed to do under Mavis's voice.
Take me out, come on, love.
The lyric was both a promise and a question. I'll take you there, to the promised land, to the place where nobody is crying, to the specific geography of justice that the gospel tradition had been describing for centuries. Mavis Staples delivered it with the conviction of someone who had been to the church her father had built in Chicago and understood that the promised land was not metaphorical, but directional. You could get there if you kept moving. I'll Take You There was the highest commercial peak of Stax's second era, the era after the Atlantic catastrophe, the era Al Bell had rebuilt with Hot Buttered Soul and Watt Stax and the Staple Singers. 3 years later, the federal marshals arrived. Number 2, Johnny Taylor, Who's Making Love, 1968. Johnny Taylor had been Sam Cooke's replacement in the Soul Stirrers, the gospel group that Cooke had left when he went secular in 1957. Taylor stepped into one of the most impossible positions in American music. Following Sam Cooke anywhere was a task that would have challenged anyone. He did it. The Soul Stirrers under Taylor's lead continued as one of the most respected gospel groups in America before Taylor himself made the transition to secular music and signed with Stax. Who's Making Love was released in 1968, the year of King's assassination, the year that the optimism of the civil rights era's legislative achievements was being confronted with the evidence of what structural racism looked like when the marches were over. The song is straightforwardly about infidelity. A man asks the question that the title contains, returning home to suspect betrayal. But it hit the R&B chart with an urgency and a specificity that went beyond the lyrical content. It reached number 5 on the Hot 100 and number 1 on the R&B chart. At the time of its release, it was the biggest R&B hit in Stax's history. The label that had been built on Otis Redding's raw urgency and the organic chemistry of the MGs had, without Otis and without the Atlantic distribution deal, found a new commercial peak. With Johnny Taylor singing about coming home to an empty house and a difficult question, Taylor would go on to have his biggest pop hit in 1976 with Disco Lady, one of the first certified platinum singles in history, released on Columbia Records after Stax was gone. The label that had built his career was dead by the time his commercial peak arrived. Number 1. Isaac Hayes, Al Bell, and The Fall. On December 19, 1975, the thing that had been building since the Atlantic deal ended in 1968 finally completed itself. Federal marshals arrived at 926 East McLemore Avenue with instructions to take the building. Three creditors who had worked with Stax, possibly acting under the influence of Union Planters Bank, had sued the label for unpaid debts. The total amount owed to these three creditors was $1,900. The building that had produced 167 pop top 100 hits and 243 R&B top 100 hits in 15 years was seized for $1,900.
Who is a man? Can we risk his neck for his brother, man?
Everyone inside was given 15 minutes to leave. Al Bell, who had joined Stax in 1965 as a black executive, risen to become sole owner of the most important black-owned music company in America, and spent years fighting to maintain the label's commercial viability against the specific institutional pressures of being black and powerful in Memphis, was executed from the building at gunpoint. Jim Stewart, who had co-founded the label with his sister Estelle Axton in a former movie theater, had mortgaged his house to try to keep Stax alive. He lost his house when the label collapsed. The bank took the master tapes, the entire archive of Stax recordings. Every session, every take, every piece of music created in that building across 15 years went to the bank. The building was sold for $1 in 1981. It was demolished in 1989. The land sat vacant. In 2003, the Stax Museum of American Soul Music opened on the site, a replica of the original building, housing the history of what had been created and what had been destroyed. The Soulsville Foundation runs a music academy for children in the economically challenged neighborhood that Stax had been part of. The music is still here. The building is a replica. The masters that were taken by the bank in 1975, the physical tapes on which those 167 pop hits and 243 R&B hits were recorded, their fate is not fully documented. The debt that destroyed Stax Records was $1,900.